Hello. Thank you for inviting me to be your discussant today for this fascinating panel. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person to address you and maybe share my comments with the audience, but I hope that this little YouTube clip is going to do the trick. I have already sent you your papers back with my comments. Most of the things that I've written in the margins are sort of similar to the things that I've put together here in my little response. But if you have any other questions, feel free to email me or get back to me. So the three papers were incredibly insightful, incredibly provocative, and I tremendously enjoyed reading them. Kang Ping's paper, extremely timely, of course, not just because of An Hui's recent movie, Huangjin Shidai, that reminded us all of what an extraordinary, talented writer Xiao Hong was, but of course also because questions of nationalism and counter-narratives remain pertinent in Chinese studies. Xiong Ying's paper, fascinating because she similarly discusses a topic, the relevance of which cannot be overestimated in the context of Republican period literature, and that is cosmopolitanism. A topic that I myself am particularly interested in and I've worked on, but also, of course, another topic that is just as relevant, and that is translation. Now, finally, Li Mei, is it Li Mei Inouye or Inoue? I'm not entirely sure. Maybe I'll just stick with Li Mei. I hope that's okay. So Li Mei's paper on Jiang Qing and the trajectory of visual representations of her. I have to say, I wish I had read this last paper a few weeks earlier, as I was teaching Jiang Qing in the context of a class on Chinese revolutionary culture. And when discussing Jiang Qing's model operas, I noticed that no other cultural figure had mesmerized my students as much as Jiang Qing. And it would have been nice to share some of those images that you have included in your paper. Well, maybe next time. Okay. So I'm going to talk first about Kang Ping's paper, then about Xiao Ying's, and then about Li Mei's, and there's no particular reason for doing that. I think in my margins I wrote most in response to Kang Ping's paper because it was kind of the longest, and he engaged with a lot of different and very complex theories, but all three papers I thought were equally well written and engaging, and there's no good reason for the order in which I respond to them. And of course, I don't even know in which order you presented them today at the conference, so the order might actually be different. Anyway, so let me start with Kang Ping's paper on Xiao Hong's The Field of Life and Death. This paper is entitled Embodiment, Identity, and Political Agency, The Field of Life and Death Revisited. And it really just fascinated me for two reasons, or two main reasons, should I say. The first one is the first paper that I presented at a graduate student conference was actually on the field of life and death. At the time, my focus likewise was on the question of nationalism, and I also challenged some of Lydia Liu's research. Liu was, of course, among the first scholars to offer a reading of Xiao Hong's work that was informed by critical theory, which is really praiseworthy. And if we now consider how many scholarly debates her initial research has generated, and still generates 20 years after she wrote that essay with which you are engaging, we must surely be grateful to her. Secondly, the second reason is Kang Ping is able to give what I think really is a new twist to our understanding of Xiao Hong's novelistic project by reading it through the framework of gender performativity, which I thought was really insightful. That was sort of the second part of the paper. The first part kind of explored the question of nationalism in the novel. And Kang Ping is taking issues with what he sees as Lydia Liu's reductionist act of pitting feminism against patriarchy, which in the context of the reception of the novel is then frequently linked to nationalism. Engaging both with Lydia Liu and with Prasenjit Dwara, Kang Ping undertakes an attempt, and allow me to attempt a pun on Dwara's important work here myself, at rescuing nationalism from reductionism, or maybe rescuing nationalism from deconstructionism, or maybe even from feminism. Emphasizing nationalism's future-oriented possibilities of gender equality and offering a reading that is informed by what is a more sympathetic approach to nationalism. Drawing on Wang Ban's recent work, Kang Ping here sees in Xiao Hong's novel an engagement with nationalism and the modern nation as a vital political community that allows for a kind of subject formation that does neither need to negate feminism nor disproportionately favor nationalism. This constructive politics, or as Wang Ban calls it, enactment of collective ideas and interests, has the potential to give rise to emancipatory politics. Here Kang Ping also draws on Benedict Anderson's seminal work on nationalism. Anderson likewise attributes much potential to the imaginative mediations that emerge from the anthropological spirit of an emergent community, his famous placeholder of the modern nation. I have one comment or maybe question at this point. Kang Ping, it sounds at times as if you are criticizing Xiao Hong for not realizing the liberating potential of nationalism. What if she did not believe in that potential? What if her personal experience of living in an abusive patriarchal society that was now, on top of everything else, ravaged by war, made her write exactly the kind of novels she ended up writing? In any case, all we have, of course, is the text, and we can read into it what we feel is a legitimate interpretation, but we cannot lament what the author didn't do or wish she had done. Now, in the second part of the paper, Kang Ping complicates his own reading of the novel as a commentary on modern nationalism by drawing on, among others, the work of Judith Butler. Kang Ping here convincingly argues that the field of life and death invites perspectives into identity as performed gender. Through his close reading of certain text passages, Kang Ping shows how certain women characters violate gender norms and perform alternative genders, a process by which these women perform flexible identities as a process of resignification to participate in broad political movements. This, I thought, was really the most insightful part of the paper. They all were great, but this was really, I thought, something where you added something really new. And I would have liked maybe for it to receive even more attention and maybe be linked more concretely to your critique of nationalism in the first part. One further suggestion for you, maybe you could have another angle on this work. I always like to sort of take a comparative approach to things, and as I was reading this, your critique of Liu and of nationalism in general, another writer whose work engaged with both feminism and state-making, modern state-making, is, of course, Ding Ling. And in particular, Ding Ling's work from Yan'an, her early work, right, from Yan'an, 1941, 42. And just as Xiao Hong's work was appropriated by critics and then formed into, or forced into an interpretative framework that did not do justice to the full complexity of the work, Ding Ling's work was also criticized for its overemphasis on feminist concerns at a time of national crisis. As a result, Ding Ling forsook the complex hybridity of nationalism and feminism that had characterized some of her early stories from Yan'an, which were really, great. And she then turned to a more orthodox Marxist literary aesthetic, right, winning the Stalin Prize and all that. Now, Xiao Hong did not do that, right? She did not stay in Yan'an, and then, of course, she died prematurely. Yet critics, it seems, performed this act kind of almost on her behalf, leaving us for a long time with a skewed reception of her work. So maybe, I don't know whether that might be an option, but you could sort of, maybe talk about these two authors and their response to to similar concerns, similar issues, and their solutions. Two books that I wanted to turn your attention to. Of course, you engage with Prosenjis Duara's Rescuing History from the Nation. As you're talking about sort of ways by which the state manipulates or taps into existing patriarchal structures, I was reminded of Duara's first work. A study that is called Culture, Power, and the State, Rural North China, 1900 to 1942, in which Duara really describes how modern state-making actually tapped into and at times successfully incorporated feudal, patriarchal, traditional structures, rural structures, in a process that he calls the cultural nexus. The cultural nexus is sort of the big keyword of that book. And of course, Duara himself has written an excellent study of rural North China, of Manchuria, during the period that you're looking at, the late 1920s, 1930s, and that is called Sovereignty and Authenticity, and I forget what comes after the semicolon. But those two books by Duara, I think, and that book, Sovereignty and Authenticity, he actually has a chapter on Xiaohong, I think. I'm pretty sure. Anyway, let's move on to Xiaoying, Identity Complex in Teresa Li's published poetry translation, The Formation of New Woman in Tianxia Monthly. The paper, at once an exploration of the positive relationship between cosmopolitanism and the patriotic aspirations of prominent Western educated intellectuals. But I think more importantly, the paper investigates the female articulation of a cosmopolitan vision by means of circulating translations of select classical Chinese poetry that Teresa Li herself had produced. Right? She had translated them into English and then made available in the journal Tianxia. This is really fascinating, and I immediately wondered if there were maybe similar translations or similar projects exist that were published in similar journals. Xifeng, Western Wind, or Yuzhou Feng, which is usually called Celestial Winds, are two journals that came to my mind, and both of them were edited by Lin Yutang, also produced at similar time, late 1930s, extremely popular, extremely cosmopolitan, focusing a lot on translation. And Lin Yutang, of course, is a figure whom I sort of missed a little bit in your paper, and I didn't actually see him or studies on him in your bibliography. I'll return to that at the end. But Lin Yutang, of course, is such an important intellectual when we talk about cosmopolitanism, when we talk about popular culture, when we talk about translation during the Republican era. And of course, Lin Yutang really was somebody who supported the feminine voice in his journals by giving a lot of female writers a platform. So Lin Yutang, I think, is somebody who, if you end up turning this into a longer work, you should look at, and I'll give you some references towards the end. Now, fascinating to me and most enlightening, I think, is your focus on seemingly trivial details, right? For example, the choice of title, as Teresa Li translates one of Tao Qian's quasi-Taoist poems as vanity for vanities, right? This leads you to conclude that as a poet translator, Teresa Li is clearly torn between her two hardly commensurable identities as a traditional talented woman and not equal member of the male-centered literary elite of Republican China, and an awakening new woman who has engaged in a highly personal literary project, the scope of which remains invisible, really, until it is presented to us through your interpretation. Right? Now, Xiaoying engages with, I don't know whether I should say you or Xiaoying. This is kind of a little awkward, just talking to a camera. Anyway, you engage with Wu Shenqing's recent work on Republican period Ci poetry, and that is no coincidence, I believe, as Wu Shenqing follows a similar premise, namely the firm belief in the discursive significance of traditional style poetry as a vehicle for social, poetic, and linguistic innovation at a time when the anti-traditionalism of the new culture movement had monopolized modernization discourses to such a degree that such a premise was simply unimaginable, right? And these poets kind of use poetry in a similar way, I find, as you suggest, Teresa Lee is using translation, right, to broaden these horizons, linguistic horizons, cultural paradigms, and just remain completely unrecognized, right? So I think what you're doing there is really in a very interesting dialogue with Wu Shenqing's work. I do have a couple more comments. The first is, the term 天下, which you, right, obviously is the term that's given the title to the journal that you're discussing, but of course you also discussed briefly the term in your introduction, and I think you need to explain and elaborate on the term a little bit more, as it is a term that is much more complex than you seem to suggest in the introduction, where you sort of equate it to a rather sort of cosmopolitan outlook that always has been attached to that term. Now, I think that notions of 天下, like notions of Chineseness at large, I'm sorry for the noise, it's the upstairs neighbor who's moving some furniture, it seems. So like notions of Chineseness at large notions of 天下 and notions of Chineseness at large depended largely on the political climate of a given epoch, right? And the Republican period, as you rightly said, really is sort of the high point of modern Chinese, or Chinese cosmopolitanism, right? But it really oscillates between an all-inclusive culturalism, cosmopolitanism, but also at times really a xenophobic racialism. And Peter Perdue has worked extensively on this question in a really interesting article entitled Erasing the Empire, Re-Racing the Nation, Racialism and Culturalism in Imperial China, which actually also touches upon the early Republican period. So maybe you can tap into that. And two books that, again, I think might really be of interest to you and to your work. First one is Shen Shuang's Cosmopolitan Publics, Anglophone Print Culture in Semi-Colonial Shanghai. Again, she doesn't really talk about women writers so much, but the idea of cosmopolitanism, of writing in a different language, of thereby extending linguistic and cultural boundaries, I think it's all things that you might tap into. And she might even talk about female writers. It's a while that I read the book. I don't quite remember. And of course, the other book that I think you absolutely have to look at is Qian Suoqiao's Liberal, Cosmopolitan, Lin Yutang, and Middling Chinese Modernity. Again, neither of these two books focus on the question of women writers so much and their acts of resistance to a male-centered literary field, but both works comment on the importance of cosmopolitanism, popular literary journals, and translation, or even writing in a different language other than Chinese. Okay. Finally, Mei Li Inoue, as I said, I'm going to stick with Mei Li. I hope that's okay. Gender and the Heroic, Constructing Jiangqing. A paper that raises the question of why real-life women have not been iconized as global heroes in the same way that men have, and why, as visual icons, women are limited to certain heroic postures, and why female visual icons seem to only appear in the form of deities or as powerful personifications of abstract ideas. Again, as I said, I would have fitted perfectly into my syllabus last semester. So if you do turn this into a published work, you have to let me know. You have to send me a copy. So by using the life of Jiangqing then as a case study, Mei Li reveals the ways in which visual memories are gendered and have entrenched themselves in the local, national, and global replication, recirculation, and reinvention of heroic icons. So Mei Li does this in 5 stages. So she looks at the 5 stages of Jiangqing's life, right? She starts by depictions of Jiangqing as a movie star, right, in 1930s Shanghai, which emphasize her extreme femininity in these sort of Hollywood-style film posters. I apologize for the noise. I don't know if the camera captures that. There's a second phase, the model wife of the young Chairman Mao during the early Yan'an years. I think what would probably need to briefly be discussed in the context, when you transition from the first stage to the second, is the different media mechanisms responsible for these images, right? We have Hollywood-style boulevard press in Shanghai via a party-controlled propaganda department. What is, of course, interesting at this point is, the point of intersection of these two different media mechanisms, right, where similar visual techniques are used for similar or opposite purposes. Right? One in Shanghai, and one in a highly politicized context. You then draw on Guo Junhong's work, and you ask, at what point do photographic images and memory images merge into forms of new visual reality? And this, I thought, again, was a really, a great theoretical intervention, something that you could have probably explored in more detail, or maybe could elaborate on, and sort of return to at later stages. It kind of drops off later on, especially in your conclusion. I thought you could have returned to Guo Junhong's work. Anyway, the third phase then, Comrade Jiang Qing, right? Jiang Qing during the Cultural Revolution, where she is seen as a sort of a feminine part of, the shift occurs from a powerless feminine partner of Mao at Yan'an into a politically engaged, potent cultural arts leader and national hero during the Cultural Revolution, right? Her pronounced masculine features now place her within a patriarchal ideology and national identity. I quote you here, right, which leads you to conclude that the propaganda period of images demonstrate, this third phase then demonstrate that Jiang Qing's gender is the price for her power. I have two comments at this point. First, you suggest that audiences were conscious of this transformation, but I wonder, can we really assume that audiences continue to connect or juxtapose new current images of Jiang Qing with previous visual representations? Remember that, on the eve of the Cultural Revolution, mid-1960s, or even in the late 1950s, right, which is sort of the third phase of your visual trajectory, 3 decades have passed, right, since those initial movie-style, highly feminized images of Jiang Qing, and at least one new generation has come of age during a time when access to Republican period visual culture was no longer possible, right, or at least very complicated. Secondly, I think you might want to explore in more detail the party's efforts of creating women as equal to men and the complexities of the women holding up half of the sky, 妇女能定半边天, right, campaign. Some of those posters created at that time, and I was thinking of this because my students and I were just looking at a lot of these images in my class last semester, and I thought that a lot of these images actually retain a striking femininity of women performing work that is usually assigned, or associated with male roles, miners and building roads and building ships. But, I thought that a lot of the times their femininity is actually almost overemphasized, which I thought was quite interesting. Also, and which sort of goes somewhat against what you are suggesting, in that third part of your discussion, and I guess the question would be whether Jiang Qing is an exception to the rule, whether the posters that we looked at were the exceptions to the rule, whether there, is some common ground, whether there were some dissimilarities. Another point that came to my mind was that there is actually a bunch of essays in a collection entitled Some of Us, Chinese Women Growing Up in the Mao Era, which came out a decade ago. It's written by Chinese women who became scholars in the United States and who are sort of critically reflecting on their own youth. And a lot of them actually comment precisely on this question, sort of depiction of women on posters and in music and in model operas, and how that formed their own identity building. Okay, so let's move along your trajectory then. The fourth stage is Jiangqing, the class enemy, a resurrection of female features, and Jiangqing dressed in female dress to emphasize her femme fatale characteristics, right? And to resurrect memories of Jiangqing as a young actress in fashionable clothing, and to question whether her political reformation had at all been real, right? That political reformation that she undertook in Yan'an. And of course her insatiable desire for power, depicted in a depraved femininity, right? Okay. And then, right, you have the contemporary Jiangqing of the post-socialist era, when she assumes so many different shapes and forms that have enabled post-Mao Chinese audiences of all political couleur to use differing images of Jiangqing to renegotiate China's unique post-socialist reality. What I was thinking when I was reading this last concluding paragraph then was that Jiangqing has been adapted and edited, reinvented, or should I say images, right? Images of Jiangqing have been adapted and edited, reinvented and reinterpreted, copied and reproduced so many times that the image of Jiangqing has come to resemble a simulacra in Jean Baudrillard's sense. A cultural product that has been reproduced, reinvented to the point where its ties to reality have become difficult to perceive, and where a separation between the false and the true, the orthodox and the heterodox, is hardly possible or even meaningful. I know that in your conclusion you shifted back, or you kind of emphasized the question of femininity, but by maybe drawing on Baudrillard, you could give it an additional twist, an additional reading, and look at the image of Jiangqing through this idea, this theoretical idea of simulacra, which I think is very interesting in the context of post-socialist China, because there are actually a lot of images or icons that have undergone a similar transformation. Mao, of course, himself, right? Images of Mao himself. And there's one other image that I'm going to conclude with. But first, I wanted to mention one other source that I think might be interesting in this context. I was looking at your bibliography, and I think of all the three papers, yours was by far the most comprehensive. The one name that I did not see in your bibliography was that of Tang Xiaobing. And, I remember hearing a talk by Tang Xiaobing at the University of Minnesota a few years ago entitled "On the Making of a Pop Icon, Chairman Mao Goes to Anyuan," where he sort of talked about a lot of the things that you are addressing just with reference to Mao. And I think that talk is included in his most recent book, entitled Contemporary Chinese Art, New Visual Culture in Contemporary China, Paradigms and Shifts, right? That's, I think, what it's called. Visual Culture in Contemporary China, Paradigms and Shifts, Tang Xiaobing. Okay, and then here comes the last suggestion. I already mentioned this, I think, before when I was talking about Han Ping's paper. I always like to think of in comparative terms. And as I was reading this, I was reminded of another woman in contemporary or in 20th century China whose image has undergone multiple transformations, really in the way that, she was imagined by multiple generations of Chinese, and that is, of course, that of Tonya, right? Dong Ya, from Nicholas Ostrovsky's iconic How the Steel Was Tempered, 钢铁是怎样炼成的. Right? She was so Tonya is, of course, the figure, the first love of Bauer of Pavel, right? The bourgeois daughter of a class enemy whom she falls in love with, and of course that becomes verbally problematic, and it becomes problematic in different terms and different interpretations of the work, right? So she was visually reproduced in at least three different movies, Soviet movies, all of which were screened in China. And then there are two sort of picture books that represent her again in a different way. And then, of course, she was imagined textually. And in the 1980s, a lot of scholars, writers, actually reflected on this transformation of the character of Tonya, of Dongya. And there's a very interesting essay by Liu Xiaofeng called 纪念 Dongya, recalling loving Dongya, that appeared in Du Shu in the mid-1990s. I gave you the reference in my comments. I was just thinking that looking at Tonya's changing reception and commenting on the ways gender identity was politicized in the PRC might relate to some of the ways that you are talking about the transformation of Jiangqing. Okay, so that's basically it. Those are my comments for your three papers. Again, I tremendously enjoyed reading them. I hope that maybe some of my comments are useful. If you have any questions, email me. And again, I'm sorry that I can't be there with you today. I hope it all went well. I'm sure it did, and I hope that you have an audience that is now going to ask you lots of really hard questions. Thank you.